Hello, friends and family. My name is Bhupendra, and I recently lost my father to COVID-19. I want to record a video of my experience to indicate what the reality of the situation is at present with regards to COVID and losing a family to this disease. It was the middle of November when my mother was diagnosed with breast cancer. Within the space of a few weeks of the diagnosis, she had to go into surgery to remove the cancerous mass. As such, we all went into isolation and could not risk her getting sick prior to the operation. My father, who was in a different province at the time, flew up to provide us support and assistance. He was a breath of fresh air, doing everything he could to support us. He lightened the mood with his jovial nature, and my mother's surgery was a success. We maintained our isolation after the operation, as my mother was still quite weak, requiring regular visits to the surgeon. After a few weeks, my father had to fly back to Durban, which was in another province, to attend to his house. He was going to fly back up to be with us for Christmas, and we had already made plans to sing Christmas carols and put up Christmas lights on his arrival. At this stage, daily hospital visits and the stress of my mother's operation were starting to take its toll on us. I developed a severe middle ear infection, losing my balance, and my sister developed a severe stomach bug. My father was really looking forward to flying up, not just to spend Christmas with us, but also to provide us support once again. A few days before he could travel, he started to feel a bit sick, and he assumed that it was due to the antibiotics he was taking from visiting the dentist. His doctor requested him to conduct a COVID test before traveling as a precaution, and he went to a COVID testing center a day before he was meant to travel. Upon arrival, he was met by a queue of thousands of people waiting to be tested. Due to his age, he was not able to stand in the queue for long periods of time, and called me to ask if I could secure an appointment with the private lab to conduct the test. I tried several labs, all of whom were fully booked for a week in advance due to many people requiring COVID testing. I eventually managed to get hold of a lab which specialized in testing for traveling purposes and was able to secure an appointment for him that afternoon. The next morning, he called me informing that he tested positive, and he was very disappointed and despondent at not being able to travel to be with us. We all remained positive despite this, and we were able to get a COVID care package delivered to him with all the medication required to fight the virus. His condition was really improving on the first few days, with a high temperature being his only symptom. He was combating this by taking Panado and sleeping. His spirits were high, and even said to me that he felt like he had a mild cold rather than the COVID virus. On day 4, he developed severe diarrhea, and I had friends in the city who bought him medication to treat this. But the same afternoon, the diarrhea had stopped. However, by day 5, he was starting to feel quite weak. At this point, I decided that it was best to have him admitted to a hospital. My father was on medical aid, so I began calling all of the hospitals in the province to arrange for him to be admitted. To my surprise, none of the hospitals had any beds available due to the sheer number of COVID patients being admitted. I was asked about his symptoms and was told that whilst I could send him to the emergency room at the hospital, he would be stabilized and then thereafter sent home. At this point, we all started to get really concerned, and I visited my doctor to see if she could give me some medication which would help with my middle ear infection and enable us to travel. However, she could not do so as my infection was still quite severe and would only permit us to travel 3 days later. I indicated to her that it was an emergency, so she did a telephonic consultation with my father and prescribed additional medication which would help his condition. By day 6, his condition worsened. The friends which were attending to him and providing him with his daily food and medication informed us that he was having difficulty breathing. I immediately called an ambulance who were on the scene within minutes and managed to stabilize my father by providing oxygen. However, they were now faced with the same dilemma that I encountered the previous day with trying to find a hospital bed. We all frantically began calling hospitals, and none of them had any bed space. After an hour, the ambulance was going to leave my father and attend to other emergency callouts. Thankfully, at the last minute, we managed to get hold of a matron at a hospital who allowed the ambulance to take him there. She said that his condition would be assessed in the emergency room, but they could not guarantee that he would be admitted at the hospital, as they were already at 120% capacity. After a few hours at the ER and multiple tests being concluded at the hospital, they thankfully agreed to admit him. We had some sense of relief at this point, as we thought that under the care of the hospital his condition would be improved. But we were informed by the hospital that he was still very ill at this point. The following day I received a call from my father from the hospital, pleading with me to find him embedded in an ICU unit in any hospital. He was having difficulty breathing, and he said that he was afraid that we would not make it at this point. He then said to me that I should perform his last rites should I not be able to find him an ICU bed. We frantically contacted the hospital to confirm his diagnosis, and they indicated that whilst they had done everything they could to stabilize him, he would have a greater chance of survival on a ventilator in the ICU. However, there were already 5 other patients on the waiting list to go into ICU due to a shortage of beds. The doctor at this point had the unenviable task of trying to determine which patients had the highest chance of survival and moving these patients into ICU onto a ventilator. For the next 24 hours, the hospital staff did everything they could to stabilize his condition and keep him comfortable. But by the following morning, I received a call from the doctor indicating that his condition had deteriorated even further. They had now put him onto a portable ventilator called a CPAP machine, but his condition was touch and go at this point. Thankfully, 3 days had passed, and we were all well enough to travel at this point. I immediately booked flights, accommodation, and a car. And as much as we didn't want to risk my mother traveling in a taxi with us due to her low immune system, we were forced to hire an Uber to take us to the airport, as most of our friends and family had already traveled away for the December holidays. I called my father to tell him that we were on our way, but he was already getting critically ill at this point, and asked me to call his doctor urgently as he was now spewing blood. This was the longest journey of our lives, and every minute spent traveling to Durban was agonizing. Upon landing in Durban, we immediately drove to the hospital, but I was not permitted to see him, as the risk of me contracting the virus in the ward was extremely high. However, the hospital indicated that they had managed to stabilize his condition with the CPAP machine and that he was resting comfortably. We checked into a lodge and spent most of the evening praying for him to recover. The following morning, I was once again contacted by the doctor indicating that his oxygen levels had now dropped to 60% and that his chances of survival were dropping by the minute. Prior to this, I had once again called every hospital in the province looking for an ICU bed, but the situation had gotten even more dire as the shortage of beds continued. My cousin also suggested buying a ventilator and sourced quotations to purchase one and have it delivered to the hospital. I asked the doctor if the ventilator would help, and he indicated that almost all patients where COVID had spread to the lungs to this extent did not survive after even being put on a ventilator. We spent the next few hours praying and meditating for him to recover, but a few hours later we were contacted by the hospital indicating that he had passed away. We were devastated, and for the first time in my life I could not seem to function. I was already being asked by the hospital to arrange an undertaker, as there were environmental concerns due to the COVID virus when patients pass away. I then had to visit the hospital to identify the body and complete all the necessary documentation. I called my cousin Mahendra at this point, who was with me through every step of the process. All of my cousin's friends and relatives thereafter assisted with everything relating to the funeral arrangements telephonically. Upon arriving at the hospital, I was not allowed to view the body to make a positive identification, as the body had to be sealed to prevent the virus from spreading. I had to resort to asking the undertakers to send me a picture later on to make a positive identification. At the time of grieving, you long for a sense of comfort by being in your own home and by having friends and family around you for support. However, we could not return to my father's house as the house had been contaminated by the virus, and I had to arrange for the house to be completely sanitized and deep cleaned. Family and friends could not visit as the virus had escalated to such levels that we had already lost 3 other relatives during this period to COVID. The funeral had to be a 10-minute drive-by funeral as the coffin could not be opened, and the number of people who could attend the funeral were extremely limited. Thankfully, we were able to perform his last rites as per our traditions. However, performing all of the subsequent prayers in the days which followed proved to be exponentially more difficult due to all the measures we had to undertake to protect ourselves from contracting the virus. We decided to return to our home in Pretoria after a few days, as we did not want to risk contracting the virus whilst in Durban. We had no option but to fly back, as none of us were in any condition to drive. Once again, we went into isolation, as my mother will be undergoing radiotherapy treatment for her cancer in the forthcoming weeks. I would like to thank everyone that took care of my father in his last few days. Everyone that gave him his medication, provided him with food, drove him to the hospital in the ambulance, attending to him in the hospital, performing the funeral service, all risked their lives to help him. I appeal to all of you, please follow the guidelines outlined by the government to keep yourselves and your loved ones safe. You only grasp the severity of this virus once it impacts you and your family directly. Doctors and healthcare workers are under immense strain, waging a war against COVID. Do not add to their difficulties by not taking precautions. Please take care and be safe. Thank you very much for your time and for listening to my message.